October 5, 1945. Camp Honolului, territory of Hawaii. The heavy mesh gate clanged shut, the sound swallowed by the damp heat of the processing tent. It smelled of canvas and sharp, sterile antiseptic. Akiko kept her hand firmly on Yumi's shoulder. The younger nurse was trembling, her eyes fixed on the American corpsman. A sign nailed to the tent pole read, "Maintain orderly line, no talking." The corpsman, barely 20, looked tired. He motioned for Yumi, lifting the cold silver disc of a stethoscope. Yumi flinched, bracing as if expecting a blow. The corpsman's eyes widened slightly, confused by her terror. Akiko stepped partially in front of her. "It is all right." "Daijobu," Akiko whispered, her voice rough. The young American paused. He met Akiko's gaze, not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, but as a nurse. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and touched the stethoscope to his own chest first. "Demonstrating. We invite you to follow their full journey of survival, and let us know which country you are watching from." This small, unexpected gesture was the first crack in her armor. 6 weeks earlier, the coast of Saipan. The transfer from the holding pen to the transport ship happened in a blur of shouted commands and harsh sunlight. They were herded up a steep metal gangplank into the cavernous, humid darkness of a cargo hold. For days, the world was reduced to 3 sensations: the constant, metallic thrum of the ship's engines vibrating through her bones, the thick, cloying smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies and the sharp tang of the sea, and the relentless, nauseating roll of the Pacific. Akiko lost track of time. They were fed twice a day, a bland, lukewarm mush served in metal trays that smelled faintly of soap. They were not beaten. They were not questioned. They were cargo. Akiko stayed close to Yumi, who had succumbed entirely to the motion of the ship. The younger nurse was pale, her skin slick with a cold sweat. She retched bile into a bucket, her body trembling with the effort. Most of the guards ignored them, standing post near the hatchways, silhouetted against the sliver of daylight. They were shadows who chewed gum and carried rifles. But one guard was different. He was older than the others, perhaps 25, with a sharp jaw and weary eyes. His helmet liner had Miller stenciled on it. He watched the prisoners not with malice, but with a kind of dull, professional irritation, as if they were a logistical problem he had to manage. On what Akiko guessed was the 4th or 5th day, Yumi collapsed, sliding from the bench onto the damp floor. "Get her up," Miller said. His voice was flat, directed at no one in particular. The prisoners near Yumi flinched, pulling away. "Hey!" Miller stepped forward. "You!" He pointed at Akiko. "Get her up, Suwaru." He butchered the Japanese word for sit. "On the bench, now." Akiko's blood ran cold. This was it, the moment the performance of civility ended. She scrambled to lift Yumi, her own muscles weak from hunger and inactivity. She hauled the semi-conscious girl upright. Miller watched, his face impassive. He barked another order at a different guard, then walked away toward the water cask near the bulkhead. He stood with his back to them for a long minute, inspecting the latches on the doorway. When he turned back, he did not look at them. He walked past their bench, close enough that Akiko could smell the faint, clean scent of saltwater soap on his uniform. A tin canteen cup skidded across the floor, stopping precisely at Akiko's foot. It was full of clean water. Akiko froze. She stared at the cup. It was an impossible object. The water ration was strictly controlled. This was extra. She looked up. Miller was already at the far end of the hold, talking to another soldier, his back squarely to her. He had not looked back. He had not acknowledged the gesture. It was a transaction that officially had never happened. Her hands shook as she picked it up. The metal was cool. She pressed it to Yumi's lips. "Drink," she urged, her voice thick. "Nomu." Yumi drank, her eyes fluttering open. Akiko watched the guard, Miller. He was just a man, checking a roster on a clipboard, frowning at the paper. He had given them water. It was not kindness, Akiko told herself. It was maintenance. He was just keeping the cargo alive. But it was also a risk. He had broken a rule for them. She felt a strange, painful crack in her certainty. The Oni, the demon, was just a tired man who didn't want a girl to die of dehydration on his watch. When the engines finally changed their pitch, slowing to a deep groan, The daylight that flooded the hold was different. It was softer, the air sweeter. They were led up on deck. Akiko blinked against the gentle sunlight. She saw green mountains rising from a perfect blue harbor, dotted with grey warships. She had never seen a place so beautiful. Camp Honolului, the Nisei translator from the beach announced, his voice devoid of emotion. Territory of Hawaii. Welcome. The truck that moved them from the harbor was hot and airless, the canvas flaps snapping in the wind. When they arrived, the gates of Camp Honolului were tall and imposing, crowned with barbed wire that glinted sharply in the afternoon sun. It looked precisely like the prison she had feared. They were marched into a long, wooden hut designated as processing. The air inside was thick and suffocating, heavy with a chemical smell that stung Akiko's nostrils. It was the scent of DDT. A stern-faced American woman in a tan uniform, a WAC, stood behind a folding table, holding a clipboard. She barked orders, and the Nisei translator repeated them in flat, emotionless Japanese. Remove all clothing, all of it. Place it in the sacks provided. You will be deloused. A collective gasp went through the group of women. This was the humiliation they had been warned about. To be stripped naked in front of their captors. Akiko's hands automatically moved to cover her chest. Yumi began to weep silently, her shoulders shaking. It is a regulation, the translator said, refusing to meet their eyes. It is for hygiene. Do it now. Akiko looked at the WAC. The American woman's face was hard, but her eyes were not cruel. They were efficient. She seemed more annoyed by the logistics than interested in their shame. Slowly, her fingers fumbling with the rotted cloth, Akiko shed the remnants of her uniform. The filth of Saipan, the dried sweat of the ship, it all fell away, leaving her exposed and shivering in the humid tent. She felt less than human, like an animal being prepared for shearing. She tried to maintain some shred of dignity, keeping her back straight, her gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden floor. She thought again of her lost toothbrush, that simple tool of order and self-respect. Its absence felt like the final marker of her descent into savagery. They were herded into a line. A male soldier, looking bored and chewing tobacco, operated a pump canister. He barely glanced at them as he dusted their hair and bodies with the stinging white powder of the DDT. Akiko flinched as the cold, chemical cloud hit her skin, but she did not make a sound. She was numb. This was the reality of surrender. When it was over, they were not given their clothes back. They were handed thin cotton towels, barely large enough to cover themselves. The WAC pointed toward a doorway at the end of the hut. Shower, she commanded in English. The translator repeated, You will bathe now. Akiko's heart seized. She pictured a concrete slab outside, a row of pipes spraying icy, high-pressure water, while the guards watched and laughed. The final, ultimate degradation. She grabbed Yumi's hand, pulling the younger girl along. There was no point in resisting. It was better to get it over with. Move! The WAC ordered, clapping her hands. They shuffled forward, a miserable, naked procession, clutching their small towels. Akiko braced herself, expecting to be shoved out into the bright public sunlight of the compound, but the WAC directed them inside, into an adjoining structure. Akiko stepped over the threshold and stopped, confused. It was not a concrete slab. It was a bathhouse. It was dim, enclosed, and filled with steam. Rows of shower heads lined the walls, separated by wooden partitions. It was private. The steam was a warm, humid blanket. For a full minute, no one moved. The women stood clustered together, clutching their thin towels, confused by the privacy, by the absence of shouting guards. It is a trick, one woman whispered, her voice trembling. It is gas, but the air smelled only of damp concrete and faintly of chlorine. The WAC, who had followed them in, sighed with impatience. She strode to the nearest shower head and twisted the metal knob. A hiss, then a spray of water splashed onto the tiled floor. Steam billowed from the impact. The WAC stuck her hand into the stream, testing it. She grunted, satisfied, then looked at Akiko, who was closest. She gestured impatiently. Go wash. Akiko stepped forward slowly. She had expected freezing, shocking cold. She flinched as she put her hand under the spray. It was hot. It was not just warm. It was wonderfully, luxuriously hot. Akiko gasped, pulling her hand back as if burned. Not by the heat, but by the shock of it. Hot water. Ofuro. The memory of home, of civilization, of leisurely baths after a long day in the hospital, flooded back with such force that her knees buckled. This was a comfort so profound, so deeply cultural, that it could not possibly be afforded to prisoners. Yumi, seeing Akiko's reaction, crept forward and touched the water herself. She let out a small, strangled cry of disbelief. The door to the processing room opened again. Hussey Miller entered, carrying a large open cardboard box. He stopped just inside the doorway, his face averted, clearly uncomfortable in the presence of the naked women, but bound by duty. The WAC took the box from him. "He does not look," Yumi whispered, amazed. The WAC reached into the box and began moving down the line, thrusting an object into each woman's hand. She was efficient, her movements brisk, like a quartermaster distributing rations. She reached Akiko. Akiko held out a trembling hand, expecting a rough block of brown lye soap, the kind used for laundry. Instead, the WAC pressed a small rectangular bar into her palm. It was wrapped in colored paper. Akiko stared at it. She could not read the English words, but she could see a picture of pink flowers. Her fingers fumbled with the wrapper, peeling back the paper. A scent rose to meet her, not the harsh smell of lye, but the delicate, sweet fragrance of lavender. It was scented soap. It was not a tool of hygiene. It was an item of personal comfort, a luxury, a small, simple, profound acknowledgement of their femininity, of their humanity. Akiko looked at the soap, then at Miller, who still kept his back mostly turned, and at the WACs, who was already finishing the line. These were the demons who were supposed to torture her. She stepped fully under the hot water, the spray stinging her scalp, washing away the white film of the DDT, the grime of Saipan, the filth of the transport ship. She raised the scented soap to her shoulder, and the first touch of the lather on her skin was electric. It was more than a cleansing. It was an absolution. It was a reclamation. She began to scrub, and as the layers of dirt sluiced away, the sobs came. Akiko leaned her forehead against the cool, wet tiles and wept. She wept for her lost unit, for her fear, for her home. But mostly she wept from the sheer agonizing relief of feeling human again. Around her, in the steam-filled room, the sound of the water was lost in the chorus of weeping from the other women, all of them clutching their small, fragrant bars of civilization. The guards slipped out, closing the door quietly behind them, leaving the women alone with the hot water and the soap. They dressed in silence, the steam from the bathhouse clinging to their skin. The clothes they were given were stiff, smelling of industrial laundry starch and sunshine. They were oversized U.S. Army fatigues, dyed a dull blue-gray, with the letters PW stenciled in stark white paint across the back and on the thigh. The coarse cotton fabric felt strange against her newly clean skin. It was rough, abrasive, and utterly foreign. But it was not filthy. It was not soaked in mud, salt, or blood. Akiko ran a hand over her own forearm. The skin was smooth pink from the hot water. The grime was gone. The scent of lavender from the scented soap lingered, a delicate, ghostly presence that seemed wildly out of place in the military barracks. They were led to a long, clean hut. It was nothing like the barracks in Saipan. There were no dirt floors or leaking roofs. There were rows of metal cots, each with a neatly folded blanket and a thin mattress. It was sparse, but it was orderly. It was humane, and that, Akiko found, was the most difficult thing to bear. She sat on the edge of a cot, the springs creaking beneath her. She held the small, partially used bar of scented soap in her hand. It was still damp, the wrapper discarded. She stared at it, turning it over and over. Guilt washed over her, colder than the ocean. She thought of her commander at the field hospital, a good man who had used his own body to shield a patient during an artillery blast. She thought of the soldiers in the cave, the one who had hissed at her to be silent, who had certainly chosen the grenade over surrender. They were dead, reduced to ashen memory, having died for their emperor, believing in the righteousness of their sacrifice and the barbarism of the enemy. And here she was, alive, clean, holding a bar of scented soap that smelled like an English garden. She felt like a traitor. The propaganda had been a lie. But if that was a lie, what else was? Was her sacrifice meaningless? Was their suffering a pointless horror? Akiko clutched the soap so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to throw it, to crush this small, fragrant object that was unraveling her entire world. This was the soft power the radio broadcasts had never warned them about. Not tanks, not bombs, but hot water and individual bars of soap. She looked at Yumi asleep on the next cot, her face relaxed for the first time in months. She looked at the other women, some already asleep, others simply sitting, staring into space, lost in the same disorienting void. Akiko examined the soap again. This was the turning point. This was not a military necessity. The DDT powder was a necessity. The rough cotton uniforms were a necessity. Even the hot water could be argued as a matter of public health, a way to control lice and disease in the camp. But this soap, this scented soap, this was a choice. Someone, a quartermaster, a guard, perhaps even Hasi Miller, had made a conscious decision not to give them the harsh, industrial lye soap. They had chosen to give them something small, something human, something that served no military purpose at all. Akiko slowly unclenched her fist. She was not a PW. She was not a Jap. She was Akiko Tanaka, a nurse. And in that moment, sitting on a cot in a prison camp in Hawaii, she was a woman who had just had a hot bath. She carefully placed the soap on the small wooden crate that served as a nightstand. She would not waste it. She would use it piece by piece. It was her anchor. It was the proof that the Oni were just men, and that she herself was still human. Life settled into a strange, monotonous rhythm. Reveille, roll call, meals, and long empty hours spent inside the wire. Akiko and the other women were assigned light duties, mending uniforms, weeding the small vegetable patch near the kitchens, keeping their own barracks spotless. The food was plentiful, if bland. Rice, boiled vegetables, and a processed, canned meat they learned was called spam. It was far more than they had eaten in the final months on Saipan, yet every meal was tinged with the guilt of survival. The guards were a rotating cast of faces, most of whom regarded the prisoners with a dispassionate, weary indifference. Hasi Miller was a frequent presence, his neutrality a silent comfort. He never spoke to them directly, but he also never shouted. The tension returned on a Tuesday. Akiko was in the mess hall sitting with Yumi, slowly eating her portion of rice. The hall was noisy, filled with the clatter of metal trays and the low murmur of Japanese. A new guard, one Akiko had not seen before, swaggered into the hall. He was broad with a ruddy face, and he was holding a copy of a local newspaper, the Honolulu Advertiser. He slapped it down on a table near the door, speaking loudly in English to another guard. Akiko could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was angry. She saw the headline, a large black furious font, and she saw the word Japs. The Nisei translator, who ate at a separate table, glanced at the paper and his face tightened. He quickly looked away, but not before his eyes met Akiko's. Later in the laundry line, Akiko asked him, "The newspaper," she said in low Japanese. "What did it say?" The translator, a young man from California named Kenji, hesitated. He continued folding a sheet, his movements precise. "It is nothing," he said. "Please." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "An editorial, a letter from a local man. He is angry. He says the army is coddling you. He says you should be treated like animals, not guests. He is angry about the food and the hot water." Akiko felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. So the public knew. They knew about the small comforts. That evening, the atmosphere in the mess hall was different. The guards were tense. The guard who had brought the newspaper was on duty again. When Akiko reached the front of the line, he was the one serving the food. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a simmering personal hatred. He slopped the stew onto her tray with such force that it splashed, scalding her hand. "Eat it, Jap," he snarled, his voice low and vicious. Akiko flinched, pulling her hand back. She did not cry out. She simply stood there, trembling, the hot liquid dripping from her fingers. Hasi Miller, who was standing by the door, took a half-step forward. He said nothing, but his eyes locked onto the other guard. The broad guard scoffed, turned away, and continued serving the next person as if nothing had happened. Akiko moved to the table, her hand throbbing. The kindness was not policy. It was not the American way. It was just Miller and the scented soap. That was an anomaly, a fluke, a moment of softness in a system that still saw her as the enemy. That night, back in the barracks, Akiko retrieved her small bar of lavender soap. It was perhaps half its original size. She ran her thumb over the smooth, worn surface. It was no longer just soap. It was a secret. It was a reminder that humanity was a choice, a fragile thing that could be given by one man and snatched away by another. She wrapped it carefully in a small piece of cloth and hid it under her mattress. Life settled into a strange, monotonous rhythm. Reveille, roll call, meals, and long empty hours spent inside the wire. Akiko and the other women were assigned light duties, mending uniforms, weeding the small vegetable patch near the kitchens, keeping their own barracks spotless. The food was plentiful, if bland. Rice, boiled vegetables, and a processed. Canned meat, they learned, was called spam. It was far more than they had eaten in the final months on Saipan, yet every meal was tinged with the guilt of survival. The guards were a rotating cast of faces, most of whom regarded the prisoners with a dispassionate, weary indifference. Hasi Miller was a frequent presence, his neutrality a silent comfort. He never spoke to them directly, but he also never shouted. The tension returned on a Tuesday. Akiko was in the mess hall sitting with Yumi, slowly eating her portion of rice. The hall was noisy, filled with the clatter of metal trays and the low murmur of Japanese. A new guard, one Akiko had not seen before, swaggered into the hall. He was broad with a ruddy face, and he was holding a copy of a local newspaper, the Honolulu Advertiser. He slapped it down on a table near the door, speaking loudly in English to another guard. Akiko could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was angry. She saw the headline, a large black furious font, and she saw the word Japs. The Nisei translator, who ate at a separate table, glanced at the paper and his face tightened. He quickly looked away, but not before his eyes met Akiko's. Later in the laundry line, Akiko asked him, "The newspaper," she said in low Japanese. "What did it say?" The translator, a young man from California named Kenji, hesitated. He continued folding a sheet, his movements precise. "It is nothing," he said. "Please." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "An editorial. A letter from a local man. He is angry. He says the army is coddling you. He says you should be treated like animals, not guests. He is angry about the food and the hot water." Akiko felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. So the public knew. They knew about the small comforts. That evening, the atmosphere in the mess hall was different. The guards were tense. The guard who had brought the newspaper was on duty again. When Akiko reached the front of the line, he was the one serving the food. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a simmering personal hatred. He slopped the stew onto her tray with such force that it splashed, scalding her hand. "Eat it, Jap," he snarled, his voice low and vicious. Akiko flinched, pulling her hand back. She did not cry out. She simply stood there, trembling, the hot liquid dripping from her fingers. Hasi Miller, who was standing by the door, took a half-step forward. He said nothing, but his eyes locked onto the other guard. The broad guard scoffed, turned away, and continued serving the next person as if nothing had happened. Akiko moved to the table, her hand throbbing. The kindness was not policy. It was not the American way. It was just Miller and the scented soap. That was an anomaly, a fluke, a moment of softness in a system that still saw her as the enemy. That night, back in the barracks, Akiko retrieved her small bar of lavender soap. It was perhaps half its original size. She ran her thumb over the smooth, worn surface. It was no longer just soap. It was a secret. It was a reminder that humanity was a choice, a fragile thing that could be given by one man and snatched away by another. She wrapped it carefully in a small piece of cloth and hid it under her mattress. Weeks bled into months. The routine of the infirmary became Akiko's entire world. She learned the names of the American medications by the shape of their bottles. She learned to anticipate Captain Davis's commands before the translator could speak. She was efficient, quiet, and professional. She had regained her purpose. The war in the Pacific was over. They had heard the news in August, a strange, garbled announcement over the camp radio, followed by a profound, stunned silence from both prisoners and guards. The war had ended, but they were still here. In early October, a new set of medical checkups was ordered for all prisoners, slated for eventual repatriation. Akiko and Yumi were marched back to a processing tent, not the same one as their arrival, but built for the same purpose. The heavy mesh gate clanged shut behind them, the sound swallowed by the damp heat. It smelled familiar, a mixture of canvas and the sharp, sterile antiseptic she now associated with the infirmary. It no longer smelled like fear. A sign nailed to the tent pole read, "Maintain orderly line, no talking." Yumi, however, had regressed. The sight of the male orderlies, the tables of metal instruments, and the curt, efficient commands brought back the terror of their capture. She began trembling. "I cannot," Yumi whispered, her hand clutching Akiko's sleeve. "Akiko-san, I cannot." "It is just a checkup," Akiko said, her voice low and firm. "We have done this before. It is for our health. They will hurt us." "They will not," Akiko said with a certainty that surprised herself. They reached the front of the line. A young corpsman, barely 20, with tired eyes and a smudge of ink on his cheek, motioned for Yumi. He looked weary, as if he had already processed 100 prisoners that morning. He picked up the cold silver disc of a stethoscope. Yumi flinched, sucking in a sharp breath. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing her entire body as if expecting a blow. The corpsman's eyes widened slightly, his hand freezing in mid-air. He was confused, perhaps even a little hurt by her visceral terror. Akiko saw the entire scene with a sudden, painful clarity. She saw Yumi still trapped in the cave on Saipan. She saw the young American, who was not a soldier about to strike, but a medical technician trying to do his job. Instinct took over. Akiko stepped partially in front of the younger nurse, placing a firm, steadying hand on Yumi's shoulder. "It is all right." "Daijobu," Akiko whispered, her voice rough but carrying the unmistakable authority of a head nurse. The young corpsman paused. He looked from Yumi's terrified face to Akiko's calm, protective one. He saw her PW uniform, but he met her gaze, not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, but as a nurse. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. Slowly, deliberately, the corpsman touched the cold disc of the stethoscope to his own chest first, tapping it. He inhaled, demonstrating. "Breathe," he said softly. Akiko nodded, translating the gesture. "He is just listening," she said to Yumi. "Like I do. Breathe, Kokyu." Yumi opened her eyes. She watched the corpsman, then looked at Akiko. Slowly, she relaxed her shoulders. She gave a small nod. Akiko stepped back, allowing the corpsman to place the stethoscope on Yumi's back. The checkup proceeded. Akiko realized she was not afraid. The power dynamic had vanished. In that tent, she had not been a prisoner. She had been a colleague managing a difficult patient. The news had come in fragments. Whispers from a new batch of prisoners, a celebratory broadcast overheard from the guard's radio, the sudden absence of B-29s droning overhead toward the homeland. The war was over. But for the prisoners in Honolului, this news was not a liberation. It was a judgment. They were gathered in the dusty assembly yard, the same place they stood for roll call every dawn. The sun was hot, but Akiko felt a deathly chill. The entire compound was silent. The guards on the towers were still, watchful. The prisoners stood in ragged lines waiting. Akiko looked at the ground. Her hands clenched at her sides. Surrender, Haji, shame. Her entire life, she had been taught that to be a prisoner was the ultimate dishonor. To be captured alive was worse than death. Now their nation itself had surrendered. The emperor, the living god, had yielded. The foundation of her world had disintegrated. What happened now? Would they be executed as symbols of a defeated empire? Would they be kept here forever, laborers without a home? Yumi was trembling beside her, her eyes wide with a different kind of fear. "Akiko-san," she whispered. "Do we get to go home?" Home, the word felt foreign, painful. Akiko thought of her mother in Hiroshima. She had not had a letter in over a year. She pictured the city, the bridges, the hospital. What was left of it? A cold, sickening dread, worse than any fear she'd felt in the cave, gripped her. The camp commandant walked onto the small wooden platform, followed by Kenji, the translator. Hasi Miller stood off to the side, his rifle held loosely, his face grim. The commandant spoke in short, clipped English sentences. Kenji listened, his own face pale. When the commandant finished, Kenji stepped forward. He took a deep breath. "As of September 2nd, Kenji translated, his voice amplified by a small microphone, "the Empire of Japan has formally surrendered. The war is over." A collective sigh, a gasp, a muffled sob rippled through the crowd. Kenji continued. You are no longer prisoners of war. You are surrendered personnel. You will remain in this facility until repatriation can be arranged. You will follow all camp rules. You will be treated according to the regulations of the Geneva Convention. The crowd did not move. There was no joy, only a profound, bottomless shock. They had lost. It was real. Akiko looked at Hasi Miller. He was not cheering. He was not smiling in triumph. He was simply standing at attention, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his expression one of solemn, exhausted duty. His posture was not that of a victor. It was that of a man who was simply glad the killing had stopped. One of the older women in the front row, a civilian from Okinawa, sank to her knees. Her shoulders began to shake, and a low, agonizing wail broke the silence. The sound was a catalyst. Around Akiko, women began to weep. It was not the weeping of relief. It was the sound of profound, directionless grief, for their homes, for their dead, for their honor, for a world that no longer existed. Akiko did not cry. She felt numb. She thought of her small hidden bar of lavender soap. A gift from an enemy who, it turned in, was not an Oni. An enemy who had treated her with more humanity than she had ever expected. The waiting was not over. It had simply changed its name. Before they waited for death. Now they waited for a life they could no longer imagine. February 1946, the day finally came. Their names were called from a list, crisp and final in the cool morning air. Tanaka, Akiko, Sato, Yumi, repatriation. The word felt enormous, too large to comprehend. They were given new clothes, simple cotton dresses and a coat, donations from a local Japanese-American aid society. They were no longer PW uniforms. They were civilian clothes, clothes for a life Akiko could not remember how to live. She returned to the barracks one last time to gather her things. She had nothing. No possessions from her old life had survived. She had only the items given to her in the camp, a comb, a spare set of fatigues she had to leave behind, and the toothbrush she had finally been issued. She folded her blanket on the cot, the movements automatic, precise, just as Captain Davies had indirectly taught her. The barracks was already empty, echoing with the ghosts of their waiting. Her hand went under the thin mattress to the small cloth bundle she had kept hidden. She unwrapped it. The scented soap was barely a sliver. It was a pale, worn-down crescent, the lavender fragrance almost completely gone, replaced by the faint, clean smell of her own skin. She had used it sparingly, hoarding it, making it last through the tense evenings after the editorial, through the long, humid nights of waiting. It was her one small private piece of dignity. She held the sliver of soap in her palm. It was a tangible piece of her transformation. She had entered this camp as a terrified, hate-filled prisoner, expecting demons. She was leaving as something else. She was not a victor. She was not defeated. She was simply a survivor. A witness. Akiko looked at the small empty wooden crate beside the bed. She thought about taking the soap with she. It was small enough to hide in a pocket, but it did not belong in Japan. It belonged here. It was a marker, an offering. It was the artifact of a moment when one human being had chosen to treat another human being with kindness, across the vast barbed wire gulf of war. She walked to the window, which looked out over the now empty compound. Carefully, she placed the small translucent sliver of soap on the wooden sill, where the morning sun would catch it. It was a quiet, final gesture. A period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Akiko-san? Yumi was waiting at the door, her face pale with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. It is time. Akiko nodded. I am ready. They walked out into the sunlight. They were marched in a line one last time toward the main gate. The barbed wire was still there, but it seemed unreal. Like a relic, a different truck was waiting. This one to take them to the harbor, not from it. Hasi Miller was on duty at the gate, checking names against the final repatriation roster. He looked different, thinner, his uniform sharper. The weariness around his eyes was the same. He checked Yumi's name and nodded her through. Then Akiko stepped up. Tanaka, Akiko. He looked up from the clipboard. His eyes met hers. He saw the nurse from the infirmary. She saw the soldier with the headache, the man reading a worn letter from home. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply held her gaze for a long second, then gave a single formal nod. It was a gesture of dismissal, of respect and of closure. Akiko Tanaka, no longer a prisoner, stood straight. She put her hands at her sides, and in the manner of her people she bowed deeply from the waist. When she straightened up, he was already looking down at his list. Next, she walked through the gate, not looking back, and climbed into the truck that would take her home.